For millions of gamers, the Sega Genesis defined video games for the 16-bit generation. Eight-bit joystick. Many gamers consider the 16-bit Sega Genesis, called the Mega Drive in the rest of the world, to be Sega's greatest game console, and that Sega was one of the greatest video game companies. The Sega Genesis had a huge library of now classic unique games in a wide variety of genres. The Genesis could deliver eye-melting graphics, amazing animation, legendary music, sweet sound, and great gameplay. There are so many incredible 16-bit games that you can only play on the Sega Genesis. I initially wanted to pick just 10 games for each game system, but the Genesis has so many amazing titles that set the bar high for that generation of video games that I needed to add a little extra games to the list. If you were to tell me that you were a retro video game collector, but you only collected Sega Genesis, I would say, yeah, okay, I could see that, because it was that good. Between North America, Europe, and Japan, there were over 1,000 games released for the Sega Genesis and the Mega Drive. I'm picking just 15 games that I would recommend that you start with. I'm sure that everyone had their own 16-bit experiences and would have their own unique choices of games. I also left off every single sports game because I'm just not that big into sports games, but I acknowledge that the Genesis had some of the best sports games ever made. If you disagree with my choices, then I wholeheartedly encourage you to state your case and tell me that I am wrong below in the comments. After you have done that, I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider liking this video, consider subscribing to this channel because I make weekly videos just like this, and ring the bell so you get notified when a new video is released. Now, onto the games. Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog is the most well-known and the most important Sega Genesis game, and for good reason. It is a damn good game. Sonic was the reason why Sega was able to give Nintendo a run for their money in the early 90s. Not only is the game quite good, it helped create a character that could be easily identified with Sega. It is over 3 decades now, and Sonic is still synonymous with Sega. It has fast gameplay, colorful, well-done graphics, a great soundtrack and sound effects, and blast processing. Blast processing is just a programming term for optimized code for drawing sprites. The Sega marketing people got a lot of mileage out of it in trying to position the Sega Genesis as faster than the Super Nintendo. For the record, both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis are quite good at different things in different ways, and it's not accurate to say one is more powerful, but it made for great schoolyard banter. Sega quickly made Sonic the Hedgehog the packing cartridge for the Genesis. Sonic the Hedgehog continues to get ports, re-releases, remakes, and sequels to this day. In my previous video, I went over differences in the Japanese Mega Drive release of the first Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic holds up over the years, and it should be the very first game that you get for your Sega Genesis. Golden Axe. When Sega's engineers set out to make the 16-bit Sega Mega Drive, they built upon their experience making arcade games, of which they were an industry leader. The entire sales pitch of the Genesis was to bring home near-perfect arcade experiences of an arcade game. The original game that they packed in with the Sega Genesis in America was Altered Beast, and it was okay. However, designer Makoto Uchida followed up Altered Beast with Golden Axe. Golden Axe built upon the side-scrolling arcade beat-em-up action of Double Dragon, but with a violent fantasy theme that was heavily influenced by the Conan the Barbarian movie and took liberal sound samples from it. It had 2-player simultaneous cooperative action and a ton of on-screen combatants, fantasy animal steeds that you can ride, and devastating screen-clearing magical attacks. Not only was Sega able to deliver a near arcade-perfect port, but they took the opportunity to extend the game and have additional final levels that were not in the arcade. Golden Axe is one of the first games for the Genesis that I remember playing that really delivered on the promise of bringing the arcade home. It is a timeless classic and an absolute must-have inclusion for any Sega Genesis home library. Streets of Rage 2. I have brought up Streets of Rage 2 in prior videos, but it bears repeating because it is that good. Streets of Rage 2 is not the first beat-em-up to be inspired by Double Dragon, the movie Streets of Fire, and Final Fight, but it is the best. It is by far the best 2D beat-em-up on any platform for decades. The graphics and animation were among the best that the Sega Genesis has ever seen and takes advantage of the bigger 16-bit megabit cartridge for 2 megabytes of gaming awesomeness. There are 4 different playable characters and some of the best crowd-controlled juggling of enemies. Streets of Rage 2 expanded on the first game, and both could deliver 2-player simultaneous action on the Sega Genesis Mega Drive, unlike Capcom's Final Fight on the Super Nintendo Super Famicom, that only had 1-player gameplay despite the arcade version delivering 2. Streets of Rage 2 was never an arcade game, but it delivered some of the best arcade action on the Genesis platform. And the music. Oh, the music. Composer and musical madman Yuzo Koshiro created not only the best music on the Sega Genesis, but hands down the most influential techno album of the early 90s. It was influenced by techno music coming out of clubs in Europe and Detroit, but the beats and insane composition Yuzo Koshiro made for Streets of Rage 2 helped shape electronic music for decades. I covered some of the regional differences in the Japanese version in my previous video. I love Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 3, but man alive, Streets of Rage 2 is pure perfection and makes the Sega Genesis look good and sound good. Everyone needs this game in some form or another. Thunder Force 2. The Sega Genesis had an amazing run of shmups, also known as spaceship shooters, or they were just called shooters back in the day before first-person shooters were a thing. Thunder Force 2 was one of the 6 launch titles for the Sega Genesis, and was a follow-up to a Japanese-only Sharp X1 computer game, and it is a port of an X6800 Japanese PC game. Thunder Force 2 is the second game in the Thunder Force series, and it's where the series really caught fire. Thunder Force 2 has multi-directional scrolling shooter stages with a top-down perspective and has alternating vertical overhead and side-scrolling horizontal stages. It has fast-paced gameplay, beautiful graphics, and a rad soundtrack with 16-bit tracks. It is considered to be one of the best Sega Genesis spaceship shooters of all time, right up there with Thunder Force 3 and Thunder Force 4. I am not terribly good at shmups, but I like them, and they make me feel like a real gamer. All of the Thunder Force games are freaking great, and this is a great place to start. Disney's Aladdin. Disney's Aladdin for Sega Genesis is a damn good game, and beats the previous preconception that all video game movie adaptations were cash grabs of low quality. Made by a talented team at Virgin Games USA, they took advantage of a large cartridge to deliver fluid, detailed character animation that is just as high quality as an actual animated Disney movie. The colors are bright and gorgeous. There also was a Super Nintendo version of Aladdin that was made by Capcom, but the Sega Genesis game is an amazing 2D platform action game. It was directed by Dave Perry, who left to form his own studio and made Earthworm Jim that you may see later in this very video. The game had a great sense of motion and movement and really captured the action, music, magic, and wonder of the movie. Shining Force. Shining Force is an amazing turn-based tactical role-playing game made by Climax and published by Sega. It is a follow-up to the Shining in the Darkness that was a quite good first-person perspective dungeon-exploring role-playing game, also on the Sega Genesis. In Shining Force, you play a group of up to 12 characters, each with their own unique skills and ability. Battles take place on a square grid, and each unit can move up a fixed number of squares each turn. Units can attack, cast spells, use items, or search the battlefield. Characters in Shining Force gain experience points by defeating enemies. As they level up, they gain new skills and abilities. Players can also equip their characters with a variety of weapons, armor, and accessories to boost their stats and abilities. In addition to battles, there's also a fair amount of exploration in Shining Force, and you can visit towns to buy items, talk to NPCs, and it is a surprisingly deep game. The graphics of Shining Force are colorful and cartoony, and the sound is catchy and orchestral. Shining Force is considered to be one of the best turn-based RPGs ever made. Sonic the Hedgehog 2. The sequel to 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog features the same fast-paced gameplay, colorful graphics, and catchy soundtrack as its predecessor. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 introduces a number of new features, including Miles Tails Prower, Sonic's sidekick and Sonic series major character. Really cool special stages featuring pre-rendered 3D graphics and challenges you to win Chaos Emeralds. Multiplayer mode, a split-screen two-player competitive mode where characters can race through the levels. The Spin Dash to give Sonic a blast of speed from a still position. This game is a reason why all games are still being released on a Tuesday. Sega planned a major marketing event and convinced major retailers to have a massive global launch of this game and called it Sonic Tuesday because of Sonic 2, and this is why most games are released on Tuesdays to this very day. Phantasy Star II. Role-playing games were seriously gigantically popular in Japan during the 1980s and 90s, and Sega didn't want to be left behind. So they created the Phantasy Star series that started on the Sega Master System and then had 3 games on the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis. Instead of being set in a Tolkien-inspired fantasy realm, Phantasy Star had strong sci-fi elements and settings. Phantasy Star II was the first role-playing game that I played on the Sega Genesis, and I loved its anime art style and first-person combat. It didn't have the first-person mazes like the first Phantasy Star game, but I played through it and I really cared about the story. The 4th game has really gone up in price, and Phantasy Star II is an absolute excellent place to enjoy this classic Sega role-playing game. If you like JRPGs, then you are going to freaking love Phantasy Star II. Gunstar Heroes. Gunstar Heroes is a run-and-gun game developed by Treasure, a number of former Konami game designer geniuses. It is hands down one of the best run-and-gun games ever made. Gunstar Heroes was Treasure's debut title and featured fast-paced gameplay, 2-player simultaneous action, innovative weapon systems, and colorful graphics. Gunstar Heroes has 4 main weapon types: machine gun, flamethrower, a lightning gun, and homing shot. And they had the game mechanic to combine them to create violent madness like a flamethrower machine gun or homing lightning guns. The graphics in Gunstar Heroes are colorful in details, and the animations are smooth and fluid. This was the first game to feature Treasure's unique art style of having smaller sprites move very fast on screen. Shinobi III: Return of the Ninja Master. Shinobi III is a hack-and-slash platform game, and it is a direct sequel to the previous game, The Revenge of Shinobi, and Shinobi the arcade game. In this game, you use swords, shurikens, and ninjutsu to defeat enemies in fast-paced and fluid combat. The characters are well animated and detailed. The backgrounds are rich and colorful. The game feels a lot faster than the previous Shinobi games, and it is one of my favorite ninja action games on any platform. It is a great way to get into the Shinobi games. Ecco the Dolphin. In all the games for the Sega Genesis, Ecco the Dolphin is unique as a captivating, super chill underwater adventure as a unique blend of action, adventure, puzzles, and environmental exploration. You play as Ecco, a young and agile dolphin in a quest to reunite with her lost pod. Ecco can swim with grace and agility, leaping through the air and explore a 16-bit underwater world. Nowadays, there is an entire genre of cozy games. Back in the 90s, it wasn't established yet, and Ecco the Dolphin helped make video games cozy and chill. It was an atmospheric underwater adventure with heart and environmental consciousness. There was nothing like this at the time, and it is totally worth playing today. Castlevania Bloodlines. Konami was a little late to the Sega Genesis party, but every single game that they put on the platform was freaking amazing. Castlevania Bloodlines is a side-scrolling platform game in the Castlevania series that follows two vampire hunters, John Morris and Eric Lecard, as they travel across Europe to stop a witch from resurrecting Dracula. It is quite a visually impressive game. The game's soundtrack is also quite good and features a number of catchy and memorable tunes. It was originally going to be released as a sequel to Rondo of Blood, but Konami decided to make it a standalone game instead. The development team approached Bloodlines as a unique Castlevania experience tailor-made for the Genesis. The game's graphics really take advantage of the Genesis 16-bit color palette. I covered yet more regional differences in a prior video. Contra Hardcore. Konami continues to hit Sega Genesis Mega Drive games out of the park. Contra Hardcore is a run-and-gun game known for its high difficulty, which is in part due to its fast-paced gameplay and unforgiving enemy placement. These Konami Genesis games are in part of Nintendo wanting to have third-party publishers have unique games for the NES and Famicom instead of ports of existing games. Rather than bringing prior entries of Konami staples such as Castlevania and Contra to the Genesis Mega Drive, Konami made new and unique games. They also made this game much more difficult when they brought it to the West, and I covered this in my previous video, why these Sega Genesis Mega Drive games are better in Japan. Rocket Knight Adventures. Rocket Knight Adventures is yet another amazing platform game developed and published by Konami for the Sega Genesis. The game stars a new hero, Sparkster, a possum knight who wields a rocket pack and a sword. It was designed by Nobuya Nakazato, designer of many of the Contra games. Rocket Knight Adventures is a well-made platform game with excellent gameplay, graphics, and a catchy soundtrack. Not to keep repeating myself, but Konami made this game much more difficult when they brought it to the West, and I covered this in my previous video. Earthworm Jim. Earthworm Jim is a wacky, fun, run-and-gun platforming game made by Shiny Entertainment, originally for the Sega Genesis. The titular Earthworm Jim is a cartoon earthworm that finds an ultra-high-tech cyber suit. You play as Earthworm Jim as he runs, jumps, and shoots his way through a variety of levels that are built with great verticality and are often traversed by jumping and grabbing and climbing ledges. Jim can use his earthworm body as a whip to attack enemies and swing from hooks. The game is filled with humorous, over-the-top gameplay elements, such as the ability to rocket launch Jim's head into enemies or to turn him into a rocket-powered skateboard. It has fluid animation, a humorous tone, and fun but pretty hard gameplay. It was headed up by Dave Perry, who previously worked on Aladdin for Genesis and set out to form the studio Shiny Entertainment. It joins Ecco the Dolphin as one of the only Western-developed games on this list. Why play Sega Genesis these days? The Sega Genesis was a truly groundbreaking pioneer in 16-bit console gaming. It was one of the first 16-bit consoles to the market, the first if you don't count the PC Engine as 16-bit, but I do. It was a huge success in North America as the Genesis, and in Brazil, South Korea, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand in Japan as the Mega Drive. But it was only a cult hit in Japan, much to Sega's frustrations. The Sega Genesis is home to many games that are considered to be some of the best ever made. There is something for everyone in the Genesis library, from platformers to action games, from RPGs to sports games. It is the system to get if you're into CRT TVs. Good old CRT TVs are what 8-bit and 16-bit consoles were made for, and the Sega Genesis looks great on a CRT. Pixel art looks great with scanlines or a shadow mask. If you're going to play on real hardware, then you owe it to yourself to get a free or very cheap CRT TV to play Sega Genesis on. The Sega Genesis originally only came with an RF adapter, but it could do RGB out and looks great on a slightly curved CRT TV, like my Panasonic here. I also have one of my Genesis systems hooked up to my JVC D-Series CRT, and it looks amazing with RetroVision component cables. There's just something about an electron gun on a CRT TV that makes 16-bit pixels come alive. It's relatively affordable, at least as far as retro games go. The systems are still easy to find, and you can probably get a decent Sega Genesis original hardware setup for around $100 at most retro game shops. Some games have really gone up in price, but a lot of the most popular ones were mass-produced, and you can still probably get a pretty impressive Sega Genesis collection if you don't mind buying loose carts. Personally, I prefer scruffy-looking carts. I consider them pre-loved and worn in. The Sega Genesis really had great third-party support, including games from Konami, EA, and many others. Sega was the most prolific maker of games for the Genesis, but there were a ton of great games produced by third-party developers. It can be a challenge. Some of the modern games are way easier than 16-bit games were. Some Genesis games were even made more difficult when they were brought to the West due to the video game rental market. So the Genesis is a great option if you really want to challenge yourself with some tough but rewarding games. The Sega Genesis is a great way to experience nostalgia for the 1990s. Playing Genesis games can bring back fond memories of playing with friends, renting games from a local video store, and staying up late to play the living daylights out of them. Different ways to play Sega Genesis. This video is about playing Sega Genesis games. Luckily, there are a ton of different options to go about doing this. Original Sega hardware, Genesis Mark I. This is the classic Sega Genesis hardware. The original version did not have the Sega Enterprise text when you powered it up, but many later versions do. This unit has mono output from the AV port in the back, but stereo output from the front headphone jack. Some game audio fanatics prefer the tones created by the sound chip, and the ones that say high definition graphics, to the later Mark II model of the Genesis. But if you want to use the power-based converter to play Master System games, then this is the one that you want. Some of the original systems have a little dimmer video output compared to the Mark II systems, but it varies between system to system. These might be a little more than the Mark II Genesis, but for some Sega fans, you just can't beat the OG Sega Genesis. Original Sega hardware, Sega Genesis Mark II. The slightly smaller redesigned Sega Genesis is no slacker either. It has more consistently really good video output, and you can get stereo output from the rear AV jack. Personally, I think the tones from the sound chip on this model sound great, and these are a little more common, and I like them both. By the way, the Sega Genesis Mark II uses a slightly smaller RGB output pin, and some video systems have an adapter to use Mark II video cables on a Mark I Genesis. The two systems also use different power supplies, and you cannot run an unmodified Sega power-based converter to play Master System games on the Mark II, but many power-based converters have had their plastic shaved off to work with the Sega Genesis Mark II, and non-Sega aftermarket power-based converters work fine. If you're not nostalgic for the OG rounded Sega Genesis, then the Mark II is a great option. Original Sega hardware, Genesis Mark III. The quite substantially smaller Sega Genesis Mark III was manufactured by Majesco, and it was a budget model. It can't run a power-based converter, virtual racing, Sega CD, or 32X. But you can slot in the Japanese-shaped Mega Drive carts that do not do a region check. It has mono sound output, but this can be changed by modders. It's not without its fans, but I personally prefer the first two models of Genesis systems. Clone systems and FPGA consoles. Hyperkin. There are a number of good Genesis clone systems out there, and I have a soft spot for the ones made by Hyperkin, including my good old Retron 3 HD that can play Genesis, NES, and Super Nintendo carts. The great thing about clone systems from Hyperkin is that they work with both modern HDMI TVs and CRT TVs, and they are simple, reliable, and cheap. But they don't work with the power-based converter, Sega CD, 32X, but virtual racing works. Analogue made an FPGA-based Genesis clone called the Mega SG that sold for $190 when it was new, but unfortunately they stopped making new units, and they now go from between $450 and $600. I missed the boat on getting one at $190, and I would get one if they made more, but I'm not going to pay eBay prices. Columbus Circle. I have a great handheld Sega Mega Drive clone called the 16-bit Pocket Plus by Columbus Circle. I like it a lot and made a video review of it here. Please check it out. Nintendo Switch Online and Expansion Pack. Many of these Genesis games are available in the Sega Genesis Nintendo Switch Online service if you are subscribed to Nintendo Switch Online and the Expansion Pack. It has 11 of the titles that I listed in this video, such as Castlevania Bloodlines, Contra Hardcore, Earthworm Jim, Shining Force, Shinobi III, Golden Axe, Gunstar Heroes, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Streets of Rage 2, Thunder Force 2, and Ecco the Dolphin. Strangely, it doesn't have the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega Genesis Mini Consoles. There also was the Sega Genesis Mini and Sega Genesis Mini 2 consoles. I love them both. Make sure you check out my video on them here. There is the Sega Genesis Classic Collection for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Switch that have many of these games. There also is the Contra Collection and Castlevania collections for PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. Sadly, Rocket Knight Adventures is still impossible to buy digitally. I purchased a cartridge copy at Portland Retro Gaming Expo, but the cart is getting up there in price these days. Genesis emulation programs and emulation devices. The Sega Genesis is easily emulated these days, and almost all decent emulation platforms can handle running Sega Genesis games easily. Personally, I use my RetroPie, RetroArch, and my handheld Mu Mini Plus. FPGA-based systems such as the Mister are a great option if you've already invested in the hardware. EverDrives. There are also a ton of awesome flashcards and EverDrives that can make a lot of hard to get a hold of games accessible to run on original hardware. I used to have a Mega EverDrive before I moved on to a Terra Onion Mega SD Pro. Both that and the Mega EverDrive Pro can even handle Sega CD games via an FPGA system that lives in a Sega Genesis size cartridge. It is madness that you can have this marriage of modern FPGA and original Sega hardware. Multi-carts on Amazon. Technically, it's nebulous regarding if it's kosher to talk about using ROM images and emulators and such on YouTube and be monetized, but I purchased a Sega Genesis multi-cart with 480 games for $33 on Amazon last year for use with my 16-bit Pocket MD Plush. I'm not sure if I can talk to you about the not quite kosher multi-carts on Amazon, but I've seen professional YouTubers that have over 1,000 times my subscribers talk about emulation systems that include ROMs that are being sold on Amazon, so I'm probably safe. The Sega Genesis is one of my absolute favorite video game systems, and I wish I could go back in time and smack my teenage self for trading in my old Sega Genesis and games to buy newer systems. The Sega Genesis is an absolute legend, and these games are a wicked place to start. I would greatly appreciate it if you would like this video, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single one, and ring the bell so you get notified for new videos. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.